Alright. Um, I do end up voting negative on the floating pick argument. I do think that it is in the 2NC when I go back to my flow. Where it emerges from is it on their responses to the role of the ballot. When they read the Yancey evidence, indicates that we have to utilize the black body as a starting point in order for us to be able to engage within state policies. Otherwise, it ends up being a white-centered form of state policy that is a view from nowhere, which means that it is possible for us to use the state, but not the state as it currently exists, but the state after we utilize one that has a question of the black body as a starting point to be able to gain access to it. I think that the 2AC should have, you have way too many state good arguments and not enough arguments answering the race component of the debate. And I think that especially in this debate, like when they give you an answer like you can never know what racism is, nothing that you could do could give access for you to be able to do that. I think that this round more than other rounds there's a very clear black-white binary that takes place here. So I think you should read some of the evidence that criticizes the use of static identity, read some type of evidence of the way that when you create these sort of racialized constructions that it puts a us versus them mentality where it's impossible for us to be able to form coalitions. Sometimes we might need insiders in order to help deconstruct the government, right? That sort of insider rhetoric would be able to link up beautifully with your role of the ballot articulation about how, as defense intellectuals, is a way for you to understand how race relations take place. And I don't think you should so quickly be like, we can never understand racism, right? Because like everyone that exists, whether white or not, are participating within structures of racialized oppression and stuff like that. And so where you're located means that you've seen racism take place. You exist within a military structure that a lot of people will oftentimes be like, this is a white hegemonic norm. So I'm sure that you probably walking through West Point have seen instances of racism that you could say that you have that you found troubling, ways that they've educated you that you found troubling, things like that. And a lot of times, like, the criticism of the white positionality is that it's not exposed as being a race, as being a positionality. So I think that if you're going against a team that is going to have a race focus, a discussion of privilege of what it means to be in the military for the two of you, for how it means for you to have your racial identities in relation to that, begins to give you a lot of traction in relation to these sort of arguments. So that when you do the roll of the ballot, it's not just like Virilio, we have to question the speed at which politics take place, but you actually take a pause there and talk about the way that the expediency of policy making is taking place in this, in order for you to reflect on how you fit into this social location where you are. And I think that if you do that, it becomes much harder for them to then sort of establish some of the arguments that they're going for in the debate. I also think that you should probably just advocate the perm opposed to doing it as a test of competition, because when you do it as a test of competition in a debate round like that, it's like theoretically we could consider race along with our affirmative, but we're still not going to do it. We're still just going to advocate the plan, right? Which means that it's not really going to solve the things that they talk about, and so then you have to win the debate theory that if it's not mutually exclusive, it's not a reason to vote for you. But if their advocacy is one that could include portions of yours, like the plan, and do this racial interpretation, that's a reason for why that alternative will be able to capture what you're doing. And if you're not advocating it, then your theoretical footnote is not as powerful as like, yeah, you're right, this was something that was mistaken. The most important thing for us to be able to actually, as defense intellectuals, is to be able to reassess where we've gone wrong. Not only is our affirmative plan a reassessment of where drone policy has gone wrong, this debate round is an example of how, as defense intellectuals, we're willing to constantly reassess the ways that we're engaging in these structures. And like you write in the 2AR, you're like, we have to listen, right? Be like, that's justification for the permutation. We have listened, and you're right. Our 1AC might have been a view from nowhere. Here's why we aren't any longer in light of the things you've said. That doesn't mean that you vote negative in this debate round, but it shows that how our reflexivity in the way that we engage in policy making is important and ought to be informed alongside your advocacy, and it's not a reason to negate us. And I think that sort of structuring of it would be, would be important. I think that if you're going to go for the state bad arguments, the 1AR, 2AR should lock them into the portion of the debate where they're saying the state can't be used, right? And so I think that you should not run into, like, your cross-sex is clear about we could use the state, we're not against the state. Your Yancey evidence on the roll of the ballot is also clear on this. But when you get to their state bad or their state good arguments, your response is state bad, right? And so I think that if they lock you into those arguments, I think that they have a decent job of selling the state as being, engaging with the state being good. And I think that you, opposed to being the no link of that, like that should at least be your first argument on that portion of the float. We don't preclude the state. Our role of the ballot has showed how we can do it, but the position of the black body has to come first. And then, even if you don't buy that, Judge, here's reasons why we should not just uncritically engage with the state, right? But the way that the debate goes down the line by line, when I get to that point, I was like, I didn't see why this evidence applied to you in the 2AC. After the 2NC, I see why it applies for you. Your 2NR brings it back to, now it doesn't apply so much because you're not going for state bad as much as you're going for the floating pick type situation. So I think that you should try and avoid that sort of arguments. Yeah, just be like, we're not against all state action. Our argument is a view from nowhere in utilizing the state is what's bad. We could do it productively if we have the racial awareness starting from the position of the black body. I think that makes it a much easier sell, especially in this round. Like maybe in other rounds it might not be as productive, but in this round when you see the 2AC is mostly lined up on state offense, then really the only card that you have to answer is the piece of evidence at the bottom of the critique, the last argument that's sort of made there about why a historical overdetermination of whiteness solidifies it. And that's an argument that's not fully addressed by them, and that would have been where I structured the 1AR and the 2AR fully on that, because that's your piece of offense that would be universal against everything, and in the way that they're articulating, you two can never be able to understand the way racism operates, is particularly salient in my mind in this round for the fact that they overdetermine what whiteness is, how it operates, right? So now it's just a matter of fleshing out that impact in relation to some of the other things, and I think that that would be, a way that you could, emerge in the context of the debate round to sort of utilize that sole piece of offense that isn't addressed as directly as possible, as necessary in the line by line on the block, and I think that restructuring of the 1AR would, flip the offense. But mostly what you two do is when you go to the roll of the ballot, you're not interacting with the responses to the roll of the ballot as much as you're repeating the necessity for us to engage within the state as defense intellectuals, and they've conceded your roll of the ballot. They don't have a counter roll of the ballot. They just say they have a better way for us to engage in terms of state intellectuals, and that argument's not necessarily responded to. It's just sort of like, well, we still need to engage the state, but if they haven't responded, if they're not negating that portion of the roll of the ballot, then you have to get to why yours is better than this inclusion of race within it. And that could be, the advocacy of the permutation could be one way that you could go about doing it within this round. I think that, when you extend the Thayer evidence about like how Hedge solves things like structural violence, it'd be helpful for you to give a couple of examples where Hedge has solved structural violence, or has solved racism, has stopped genocide, various different things like that. So that way you have examples that you could point to. There aren't sensors. So you can have examples to where like hegemony, when working with people outside of hard power, where soft power has been able to solve racial conflicts, right? Like if you're doing Pakistan, right? India, Pakistan, racial conflicts between the two populations, there would be a great example in relation to your affirmative. And there's other examples in terms of like different conflicts the U.S. has intervened in, not militarily, but through soft powers, where we put peacekeepers on the ground, where it's helped sort of solve racial conflicts. Those sort of examples make it become less like, hey, we have this piece of Thayer evidence, and more like, now we have a specific argument about how it is that it could be able to take place. And now, as we enter into the military, and as we graduate from West Point, these are things that we could keep in mind when we figure out how to utilize hegemony in productive ways opposed to destructive ways. And especially if you keep those things in mind with the racial awareness, then that sort of becomes a very easy way for how you could sort of capture the role of the ballot and be able to sort of like leverage the offense that you have in this round against them, merging into the later portions of the debate. I would, when you say, basically, your answer to them, like you say there's almost nothing that they could do, period, like straight nothing that they could do to be able to have had an awareness.
I meant to say there's nothing they themselves can do, but a lived experience through the black counter gaze is the only way for them to look at.
Right. I would still say that response still comes off as they lose because they're white because they can't do the black counter gaze. So I think that if you explain that as a situation where it's not there's nothing that they can do, they have to recognize the black counter gaze and see themselves reflect in the mirror, which means that they have to talk about that sort of relationship, right? And then if you're like, listen, because then you could be like, there was something that you could have done in order to have your conversation about defense intellectuals and hegemony in a way that was paid attention to your social location and your race positionality in response to the black counter gaze that is so prevalent in debate at this moment. And you should give recognition to the fact that immediately after Kentucky, there's been all these sort of forms of racialized violence that have been taking place, and at least have a conversation about that. And in the world where you do something like that, then the link becomes more apparent because you're like, there's something that we could have done. When your cross-examination answer is there's nothing that they could do, right? Then I think there are arguments about like, hey, it's a link of omission. I think there are arguments about like black-white binaries. Those sort of things become a lot stronger in that sort of world. So I think if you could be like, listen, there is a world where black and white allies can exist, but the way the 1AC is constructed doesn't pay attention to those sort of nuances, makes it so that way it's not a situation of like, well, you lose because you can't understand what racism is for me because you don't have a gun pointed to you at all, walking down the street. It becomes a situation where it's like you need to have a critical reflection of what it means for when you walk down the street of Cambridge and when I walk down the street of Cambridge, and have that form of discussion that takes place. And I think that then it makes your story a lot more sellable and pitchable, especially in the world where if they get up here and they're sort of criticizing the black-white dichotomy, or they have an emphasis on the necessity to work from, utilizing insider, tactics as well, and not just sort of struggling from the outside. I think that makes it easier for you to pitch those things, because then you show where they've screwed up, opposed to just sort of like, well, it's impossible for you. And if it's impossible for you, that's where you all could latch onto your universalizing whiteness arguments. That's where you could latch onto those sort of things. So I think that, you have pieces of offense that you can be utilized, but you need to point directly to where it's happening and applying it, and then sort of impact those out more, because the repetition of just sort of the role of the ballot and the thesis of your affirmative in this round doesn't necessarily gain traction in the world where they're just like, we have to start from the position of the black body. It's like, okay, so how does anything that you say necessarily respond? And there is a couple of ways that you could get it to, but you don't necessarily do those forms of the interactions in this debate. And I think that just requires just a slight retooling of the way the 1AR or 2AR gets into the round, and then the 2AC can be improved by just sort of reading a bigger diversity of arguments on the race question and less on the state question, because, outside, like, I get it, the first card said neoliberalism, the state is necessarily white, so you want to have some responses to that. So it's smart that you did that. I think you just overcovered that link argument versus some of their other link arguments. And then, in the human rights stuff, you're right, their first card isn't very good, but the card that they read in the block is much better, and sort of saying that the way that, human rights has been constructed in ways where only certain individuals are determined as deserving of rights that are done in terms of in terms of ways where certain bodies are not included as being necessary to protect versus other bodies we protect. I think you're doing a decent job of being like, listen, we're stopping targeting of the Pakistani bodies, the non-white bodies which are currently being targeted in terms of racism and things like that, but I don't think that necessarily, I think that's a good defense of your plan, not necessarily a defense of like human rights discourse in abstract. So like if there was a link that I was going to be, that I'd point to, that would be the link that I would sort of see. I don't think it needs as much of a link story if there's just a better starting point to approach the plan via pick. But I think that that would be the link story. So justifying the rhetoric of human rights versus the plan action, which is sort of your approach to do human rights, be sort of the way to check back against that argument. I also think while T is not gone for, the 2AC's answers on T is incredibly scary from a judging perspective. Like, I think that if they wanted to go for T and the negative block collapsed to T more fully, I think it would have been hard to come back. I think the 1AR did the right thing by making sure the door was shut on T by having sort of over coverage, and I liked how you were like, they were new interpretations, this justifies new answers, here's a whole bunch of new answers that you could do. So that's where like the generic like to P stuff came, so I thought that was very smart that you inserted that in there. But I think that you need to have sort of a more structured 2IC block to topicality where there's like a we meet, a counter-interpretation when you have standards to your counter-interpretation for why what you're doing is, why your interpretation is good, why their interpretation is bad, and those sort of things begin to emerge in the 1AR where their interpretation is bad because it stopped new laws from ever being considered. New laws are the best way to consider the way for us to be able to restrict, right? That's a neg interpretation over limits argument, and so that argument should probably exist in the 2AC. And so like, given the way the 1NC looks, it's like, it seems like they're probably not going to go for T, but given the coverage, I would have probably gone for T. And I am someone who will vote on T and on procedural arguments, especially if in the world where it's mishandled. So, you don't have to feel like you're locked into going for the K just because of who I am. But like, if there's a mishandled T violation or procedural argument, that's something that you collapse to and explain and go for, independent from other things in the round.
I guess I have a question about that. Like, I guess I read that increase means pre-existing in response to counter. Was that new enough where it justified those answers, or did it just sound new? Or
no, I mean, I saw that as an answer to what the 2AC said, and you needed to have a definition of increase to limit that out, so I think that was correct. But doing that also means that they get some new answers to your increase thing. How many of it, like, use reasonability instead of, like, competing interpretations, that might be an unjustifiable new one. But their argument about how your interpretation is bad because now they can't do new laws, that one's justified in relation to your new interpretation of increase because that was not in your original violations. So some are new, some are not new, but I mean, what is new and what's not is always, a shaky line that's debatable, so it would be up to you to tell me which ones are new and which ones are not new. And I think the 1AR did a good job of sort of being like, sort of explaining how they're answering your increase portion of it. So I don't think I would just sort of spot them as being, you know, entirely off the wall, but then you have now the ability to do competing interpretations versus reasonability, and the 2AR is in a bad shape to just really start being able to get into the debate at that point. So I think that, you know, even if the new arguments, you know, if you went for 6 minutes, I think you would be in good shape. I don't think the 2NC does enough for you to be able to win it, given the 1AR's coverage of it. So if you did want to go for it, I would say that you probably would have had to spend like another like 2 minutes or so in the block, so that way you sort of really get through all the things, sort of, you know, hash out some of those, like, you know, some of the ground standards more, and some of the standards that exist in the original one on C shell. And then if you wanted to collapse to it fully in the 2NR, that would have been a possibility. But I think the 1AR effectively beats back, and it would have been harder to do that versus just going for your roll of the ballot, or just your pick in terms of the roll of the ballot type argument.
How was the 1NR deployment on the K?
The 1NR deployment on the K, I think, was good. I think that your answers on the perm sounded like you were just sort of reading a generic block, opposed to, like, you know, interacting with the permutation. I think you're right. Like, there's the perm comes out. There's 2 times that the 2AC mentions perm. The first is just perm. There's nothing that is mutually exclusive. We could do them in tandem. But then the second one is perm, do the F and do the K, and that's where he says it's a test of competition. So there is a text for you to be able to work with. And if you don't think there's a text, you should get in cross-examination, write down the permutation text for you, so that way you can respond to it and then interact with it as a result. And the other thing that I think you can do to improve the 1NR is that pulling out quotes from their evidence in order to show where it has just sort of a, you know, U.S. knows best, like other countries will follow, right? And, like, you know, I'm pretty sure that Nye somewhere within there will have something that you could point to that, you know, it appears white and things like that. And the more specific links that you can pull out from utilizing their evidence, the better it's going to be, because I do think that, you know, while I see the link stories, it also seems semi-generic simultaneously. And so, like, if you're going for the human rights link, go to the human rights advantages, pull out the quote from it that does that universalization that is Eurocentric, that your evidence is referring to, opposed to it just being like, human rights is Eurocentric, that's that. Whereas their specific deployment of human rights Eurocentric, right, as a form of discourse, and that would make it a lot better. And I think given how much prep time a 1NR has, the best thing 1NR could ever do is utilize that time to make specific answers and make specific link applications to the cards, because you could have time to read all of the 1AC evidence, read all the 2AC evidence, and do that. And then when the 1NR does that, 1AR is in a world of hurt because they don't have the prep time or the speech time to be able to answer back all those indicts or those specific link applications. And then 2NR could just cherry pick the ones that the 1AR doesn't go for, and it becomes a very sort of easy sell if the 1NR does those speeches. Which is why, like, you know, in my mind, 1NRs win debates very often, but only when they get to that level of specificity. Otherwise, it's just sort of like another speech. And so your 1NR was not a round-winning 1NR. It was just a, well, now we're not going to lose on the permutation and link story, versus we have won the debate because they have too much to cover in order to get back into the link debate because you've done those sort of specific applications. And so that's always how I recommend using 1NR speech time. Other questions?
Super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think that, I mean, it wasn't, you know, I started with the 2AC was a bad strategy. It wasn't a bad strategy. Like, I think you had the right tools. It was just a matter of deploying it, and a little bit more diversity would have made it harder for them, because they could essentially group a huge portion of that 2AC. So even if, like, you want to go for the state stuff, like, as explicit as it is in the 2AC, means that they could just put a wall there and sort of group that. So if you have just sort of like 1 or 2 cards that's hidden as your like number 4 or 5 or something like that, much more likely that it'll go undercovered if you have some other diversified arguments. And I think that would be beneficial. But I think you should definitely have like a race block that you're used to, because obviously they're not the only team who's doing race, you know, type Ks. So you need to have more arguments about race. And I think that, you know, even though most will no link the black-white binary type situation, I think that a lot of times if they're not if like the race teams aren't nuancing it enough, it's very easy to sort of sell black-white binary if they're not having a more nuanced discussion of those sort of things. Then you get into intersectionality as a way of having offense and things like that. And so that's one way that you can approach it. We're using a book called Brown is the New Black, and then Brown Skins, White Masks, that talk about the way the brown body has to be positioned as either black or white, and that forces itself to normalize one way or the other, and there's no position that exists in between. In the brown body, which is actually talking about Indians and Pakistanis specifically, which would be really good for your app, is something that gets excluded from these sort of race debates that have to deal with just sort of blackness within the context of America. And so if you focus on the necessity of international dynamics and the way that we interact with not just black populations or not just African populations, when you get into military planning, you get into, you know, populations that aren't necessarily, you know, is an Indian a race? Is a Pakistani a race? It's a nationality, but they are also raced. And so those sort of like identities begin to sort of problematize easy black-white distinctions, and then you're able to sort of leverage that as offense for how sort of they, you know, oversimplify, and then that oversimplification is one that doesn't allow us to actually engage into the complexity of international relations and drone policy and things like that. I think that then that becomes offense that can be utilized and deployed in relationship to your affirmative.
When I answer the pick, would you have used the sort of essentialization of whiteness arguments, or lean into theory?
For the pick, I think that like it emerges new, so I think that you would be able to then, I think that would justify new permutations. I think then you could advocate that permutation then as separate than to do the plan and do sort of the sequencing that they've done. I would definitely, you know, also be like, hey, you know, theory, you had no point in the 1 and C that this seemed like it was going to be a pick. It seemed like it was just a K of it. Now suddenly your alternative has shifted pretty radically, and so you can make some arguments against that, you know, performatively. And then you could also be like, you know, if you're going to go for the state stuff and you want to do the state, you could also defend like, no, state has to be a starting point. The question of how we deal with the black body has to be read through the state, right? I mean, obviously they're going to, you know, that's the antithesis of their argument, but now at least you have a clash point that shows why the pick is bad, and the affirmative permutation that starts with the state and then includes the questions of race is a better sort of sequencing question, right? That could be another way that you could go about answering that pick. But also you could also be like, listen, don't accept that pick because they've made a whole bunch of arguments about how the state will always be white, right? And so it's like, you know, so like if you lock them into some of the stuff that they say in the block and hold them to that, and so cross-examination, you should be asking stuff like, so how come the state can't ever do anything effectively, right? And then they're going to be like, you know, they're going to, you know, assume that you're going to be going for a state good type argument, and they're just going to talk about why the state is horrible, why we should never use, why we should never engage in the state. And then come the 1AR, you be like, listen, hold them to their cross-examination about how the state will always be white and can never be utilized. That means they can't get access to the pick. They can't get access to, they utilize the state because they've explained why the state can never be utilized. And so you sort of reverse pitadum them, where you say you ask them questions that you want to get them to say how the state is so horrible and that we should never engage in it, and then you suddenly get the link to all that stuff in the 2AC that there's essentially no linking in this debate. So it's sort of like just locking them down into those things a little bit stronger, and then I think that what you had is a lot of offense against them opposed to what happens in this debate where they're sort of able to wiggle out.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Anything else? All right. Yep. Thanks.